In the previous video, we had a look at how we can use the media element source node and pass it into the web audio API. And that method works great for playing longer audio files because it comes with buffering out of the box. And that means that the browser determines if enough audio has been buffered before it allows the audio to play. But there's another method of loading audio files, which is probably better for loading files on the go whenever you need them. Also, it is better for preloading one or more sounds, especially if they are shorter audio samples that you want to use in, for example, a game. So you can make sure that they are all fully preloaded and ready to play whenever you need them. So before we do anything else, let's set up this boilerplate here. I only have like an empty index.html file here, and I link to the main.js file, which is empty. I have a styles, which is just I'm just centering everything on the screen, and then I have an audio folder with 3 different audio files in it. In the index file here, let's create a button to start with, so we can set up the audio context. That's just going to be a button, and I'm just going to call it set up audio CTX, because as you remember, we have to have a user interaction before we can do anything with the audio context. So we're just going to set it up on the click of this button here, and let's give it a class of start. Then inside our main.js file, we should grab it. Let's call it start CTX btn, start the context button. And we're going to just select it. And we gave it a class name of start. So now we got that. And then we want to add an event listener to this. So that will be start context button, add event listener. We're going to listen for a click in our case. It could be anything. And then we're going to run this arrow function. And here we are going to set the audio context. We're just going to start the audio context. But before we can do that, we want to have global access to the audio context here. So I'm just going to declare it in a variable. I'm not going to set it to anything. Then in here, we can set that equal to the new audio context we create. So audio context is going to be a new audio context, which we talked about in the previous video. And there we have it. We already did that, and now we're not going to get the error in the browser before. We don't have to resume the audio context on a user interaction. I'm just going to console log that we actually initialized this one here, just so we can see what's going on for demo purposes. So console log and audio context started or initialized, whatever you want to call it. So far, so good. Let's see in the browser, and actually you can open this up in the live server, which I like to do, just like this, and then we should be able to see this, and we shouldn't get any error when I open up the console here. This is just a favorite icon that is not being loaded. So I can click this one, and it says audio context started. So now that audio context is ready to go, and it's stored in this global variable here. So in order to play anything, we need some files, and as you can see, I have 3 files here. I want to load all of those files. You can load files individually, but you can also load an array of files. We are going to use the built-in fetch API to get the files, and let me write a function for that. Let's just call it get files, and or get file, just one file at a time, I guess is the best thing. And we're just going to take in the file path that we want to load. And here we're going to have to call the fetch API with that file path, and then we're going to get an array buffer from that. But in order to do that, because we have to wait and because we have to call this function from elsewhere, we're going to declare it as a asynchronous function, just by adding async in front of the function declaration. And then we're going to make a response, because that's what we're going to get from the API, and that is we're going to have to await it, because the reason we have a wait here, if we have a wait in here, we're going to wait for something and it's not going to block anything. So it means it just waits until this has been returned and then it just keeps going. But in order to have that inside a function, you also need to have async in front of the function here. That's the reason we're doing that. And we're going to await the fetch API, and we're just going to pass in the file path. And then we get that response. That's not a file path, that's a file. Okay. And then we're going to take that response. It just returns the raw data to us. We're going to take that response and we're going to make an array buffer, which is like a standard JavaScript way of working with files. So we're going to create that. And we're going to await that as well, because that is going to take a little bit of time. That's an asynchronous function. And we're going to take the response and we're going to just run an array buffer method on that. Then we have that in the array buffer. And then we are going to make an audio buffer, which is actually what then we can play back the sound from that audio buffer. But we have to do something else. I'll show you that later. But let's make another constant and call that the audio buffer. And that is going to be, we also have to await this. And now we're going to need the audio context, which we created. And on that, we're going to decode audio data. And we're going to pass in the array buffer. So that's what we got, and that's basically it. Now we can just return the array buffer. This stuff is not really going to do anything right now. We just set up a function to load different files and return the array buffer that we get from the, oh, sorry, actually it should be the audio buffer, like that. Okay, so let's set up a function where we can set up the audio files that we need to load. Let's call that setup samples. And that's also going to be async. It's going to take in path, or actually paths, if there's more than one, which in our case we have. Here we are going to create audio buffers, which we are going to return. But because we have, it's possible for us to pass in an array of different paths here, we are going to need an array to push those audio buffers into. So I'm going to create that first. Let's just call that audio buffers. And that's just an empty array for now. And then here we want to loop over the array that we pass into this function. And then we want to get the files, get all of the files, and then add it into this audio buffers constant, this array that we just created. To do that, we're going to need a loop. And you can't just use any old loop, like a for each will not work on this. You need to use a for off loop, because we're going to get something, we're going to await something in here. You'll see in just a second. So let's set up the iterator here. That's going to be the path off paths, just like this. And then in here, we are going to set up the sample one at a time. And that sample that we're getting here, we need to await. And you guessed it, we're going to call the get file, and then we're going to pass in the path. And when we get the first file, we want to push it into the audio buffers here. So we're just going to take this and we're going to push all of the different files into that one. So push, that will be the sample. And now that that has been done, we should have the audio buffers is full of whatever we passed into this. I haven't set up anything yet. We'll try that in just a second. But I just want to show you guys that we're starting it here, just to see when we start setting up the samples. I want to console log something. Setting up samples. And when we're done, before we return anything, I'm going to console log that we're done. Setting up done. All right, and then we're going to return the whole array audio buffers. So like this. Okay, we're going to need something, a way to set up this thing here. And we're also going to need an array of the paths here. So let's set that up here. And let's call that sample paths. As I said, it's going to be an array. And I'm just going to type up the path of all the different audio files we have here. So, and there we have that. And it looks like they're the right one. The first one is an MP3. The others are a WAV file. So that's great. Okay. Okay, so that has been set up right now, and the next thing that we want to do is actually we want to play the samples. So up here we're getting the files, and then we're returning the audio buffer that we're decoding here from the audio context, decode audio data. And then we have another function which is also async, and we're setting up the samples here. We're just creating an array, and we're returning everything that we get back from this function up here into that array. But we also need a way to play the samples. So let's create another function. And that is going to be a function. This is not asynchronous. And let's call it play sample. And here we're going to take in the audio buffer, which is stored in this one here that we'll get that later. And we're going to take in time. And in order to play the sample, we need a sample source. You remember we talked about that we have a source that we need to connect to a destination. Then we can put different nodes in between of them. So let's create that source. That's going to be called sample source. And we're going to use the audio context again. And we're going to create buffer source. And that's just like this. And then we have to take that sample source and set the buffer. So that's just, we do it like this. That will be the audio buffer that we're passing in. So now we have that. We can actually just connect it to the destination. So that's just a sample source. Connect. And we're connecting it to the audio context destination, which is your speakers, most likely. And that's kind of it. Of course, we need to play it. So down here, we're taking the sample source, and we are running the start method on that. And then we're passing in the time, which also we pass in here. So now it's time to connect everything, and let's create another button to do that. First, we want to set up the samples here. And okay, that's going to have a class of, let's call it setup samples. And let's just call it setup samples here. And then when we click that one, we are going to be able to set up the samples, which we have in here. So if I save that and I go back here, and I'm going to just copy this one to grab the element here. And it's going to be, let's call it setup samples button. And we called it setup samples like this. And then we can add a event listener to that. Let's do it right down here. So that's a click, and that is just going to run this function. So here we are going to set up our samples, and we already wrote this function, so let's just call it. And what we're going to pass in here is our sample paths. So that's the array of all the samples that we made up here. And because it's an asynchronous function, the setup samples function here that we created earlier, it's going to return a promise. So we can tag on a then here, and that is what we want to do whenever this has been done. And we're also going to get a response. The response is going to be what we return here. That is our array of audio buffers. And whenever we get that, we are going to run this function. And what we really want to do, because we want to have global access to all of our samples. So up here, we're just going to create a variable called samples. then we always have access to that. And then we're just going to say that we get the response here. So we're just going to take the samples that we just set up and set it equal to the response. So then the samples that is globally available here will contain all of the audio buffers. And now we're actually ready to take those audio buffers and play them. But we need something so we can set up an event listener or something like that. We need a way to fire these different sounds to make them play. I'm just going to, just for demo purposes, make another button in here. And let's just call it play sound or whatever. Set up samples. Let's give it a class name of play sample. And in our JavaScript, we're just going to get it as well, just up here. And that was okay. So we already have access to it here, but we don't need to add an event listener before everything has been loaded and set up. So in here, we can just take that one and we can add an event listener right here. So that will be the play sample button right here. Add event listener. And let's listen for a click one more time. And then run whatever we want to run here. And that would be, we want to play the sample right here. Actually, let's just look at the samples. I just want to console log and make sure we haven't made any errors yet. Let's just see what happens if we go and check this out in the browser. So we got to set up the audio context first, okay. And then we got to set up the samples. Setting up samples. Okay, I got something going on here. Add event listener, add something here. And of course, that one should not be right here. It should be above. So we haven't done anything to the event listener yet. Let's just see and go back to the browser and set up the audio context, set up the samples. And it takes some time, but we do get an array here with the audio buffers, and we can see the different things here. We have something going on here. Yeah, we'll have a look at that later, but we're getting something here. And I think we are adding play sample button here, play samples, play sample button. Maybe it's called something else. It's just called play sample. Isn't that correct? Oh, play sample. That's why. Then we shouldn't get that error. Let's just try it one more time. Set up the samples and we get this. So that's great, all is good. Now we just need to play the sample actually. So we can actually just take play sample that we made earlier, and we can pass in the samples, the sample or the audio buffer, but that would be inside the samples right now. And if we want to play the first one, it's in an array, so the first item is going to be 0. And then we also have, we can whenever we want it to play, so that's going to be right here. So we're going to pass in 0 as right now. So let's see if that works. So I'm going to set up the audio context, set up the samples, take some time. Oh, it's setting up, it's done, and now I'm going to play it. And there you go. We get sound, which is great. But I can't really do anything. If I want to stop this, it's that's not really easy because I need to get a handle on it. Let me just save this again so I don't have to listen to this music all the time. And this time here is whenever we want it to play. What time? It's like you can have a look at the audio buffer source node on the MDN Web Docs here. You can whenever you want it to start. So when that is the time in seconds at which the sound should begin to play. So we can set that if we want it to be a little bit delayed. The current time is right now, and the default is 0, so it should start playing right now. We're not going to mess around with that right now, but let's just see if we can change the sample here. We have the other one, the second one in the array is the laser. Let's try and get that one. And let's try to set up the context, set up the samples, and then play when it's done. And we hear laser, and we can try the other one here, which is number 2, and then we're going to be able to do the same thing for that. Set up the samples, wait for the loading, and play it. Nice bubble pop there. But the thing is, we can't really do much because we don't have a handle on this. So if we want to stop it, we can't really do that. So down here in our play sample function, we should probably just return the sample source, because then we will get that here, and we can let's just make a constant here and call it playing, because that is the sound that is playing. Let's change this to the long one here. So it's the first one, because then we're going to get something here. Just want to console log it so we can examine what it is. And let's do the same thing again here. Set up the samples and play. It's done. And we get it right here, and then we can have a look at it. And you can see it's a buffer, and you get all sorts of different information on this here. But you also have, if you go through this, you will see that we do have on the prototype here, we have a loop, we have a start, we have a stop somewhere as well, and that's what we can use on this one. So let me just prove that to you. Let's say that we want to stop this after just a couple of seconds. So we can do that just by adding a timeout. Let's say we want to stop it after 2 or 3 seconds. So let's set timeout. And let's just say that we have the playing here, and we just want to run the stop method on that. And let's see what happens. We want to, first of all, here we need to pass in how much time we want. So let's say 3 seconds. So right now, after clicking the play button, it should stop automatically after 3 seconds. Let's try it. And it does. That was 3 seconds of playing. So this is just one way of doing it. We are using an array, so we're passing in, you know, the index of whatever sample we want to play. But you can probably also just use an object if you refactor the code a little bit, where you just pass in the property name, and then you're gonna get it. So you're probably thinking, why do I have to create a buffer source every time I want to play the sound? It doesn't seem very optimized, does it? I did some Googling, and I found the web audio FAQ here, and it says, the question is, I've got an audio buffer source node that just played back with node on, which is start now. It has been renamed to from node on to start, which is this one down here, right there. And I want to play it back again, but it doesn't work. And then the answer is, once a source node has finished playing back, it can't play back no more. To play back the underlying buffer again, you should create a new audio buffer source node and call node on, or start as it is today. Though recreating the source node may feel inefficient, source nodes are heavily optimized for this pattern. So that's what we got to do every single time. It doesn't really matter, but now I think you get the idea how we can use this and how we can load multiple sounds asynchronously whenever we want to, and just have access to all of these wonderful buffers that we can play whenever we want. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and please like and subscribe. I like when you do that, and tell your friends and everything. And in the next video, we're going to have a look at how we can get audio into the computer with other methods. See you then.